Karolina,
Yeah.
thank you so much for making the time. I'm really excited for this conversation because actually a bit of a background story. We met actually from a train journey, not that long ago actually, about 2 months, going to Istanbul for a conference. And I was really very fascinated by some of the stories you shared. And yeah, today we have a chance to talk about some of them in a bit more detail. And maybe we can start with you just introducing yourself a bit about who you are, what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Karolina Eklöf, and I am based in Stockholm, where I work at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. That's an international institute that is focused on research on traditional security questions. And I happen to work in the climate change and risk team.
Cool. And so you mentioned institute, and I think I would love to start off with one of the story you told me about going to Latin America, and especially I think in this context of having the COP move from Chile to Europe again, to Madrid. And if you maybe can just tell us a bit about, because maybe what this journey was you did there, and then what of kind of some of the stories where you spoke about, like some of your discoveries traveling there.
Yeah, so after having spent some time at the Swedish mission to the UN in New York, I could write my thesis, and I had been quite engaged in the climate issues on a very global level. And it was clear to me that this is, the impacts are always local. And I wanted to interrogate more intimately what actually happens on a local level. And in the climate security or climate conflict literature, there's a bias towards Africa in general, mainly perhaps because some countries are English speaking. There's a lot of aid being flown into Africa and so on. So I wanted to zoom in on a region that hadn't been given that much attention in the research communities. So I went to Cali in Colombia, where I identified a project where thousands, it must have been up to at least 20,000, thousands of people are being moved to from the river basin where they had established communities for decades, informal communities, but still definitely functioning societies with their own schools and their own concepts of cohesion and security. And they had to be moved because of the flooding risks in Cali to urban, newly built areas. And I wanted to interview them and see whether they found that their security actually had been improved after being moved. Because we take for granted that, yes, there's a flooding risk and there should be environmental protection, making sure that no one is in danger of being flooded. But there's many more questions to that also often are neglected when we discuss the issue of environment and climate. Is also quite often black and white. And even though I think that is correct, that one should protect communities from flooding risks, again, the story just doesn't end there. So I went to interview them, and luckily I had learned Spanish, so I could speak to them in their language, and it could be quite an intimate conversation. And I had been told by advisors or scholars or people in Europe that, or in fact even in Colombia, in Bogota, that had told me that you're going to have to spend a lot of time having to explain to them what climate change is. There's probably not going to be much resonance there. And it didn't take long into our conversations my conversations with the locals before they finished my sentences saying, I mean climate change. Of course, these are the effects that we receive as a family, and that was everything from physical effects of their houses being flooded. They could point out up to this level yearly. When that happens, we need to do this and that. Health consequences, there's reoccurring sanitation and health issues that occur. And of course, just the community, you need to start over to a certain extent. You need to rebuild your houses, and you need to, and so on. So they were aware, and they were also grateful for being moved because of the environmental risks. However, the main finding or the main response was also that it's not easy having to be moved very radically from where you have spent your whole life, generations, and to be moved to something else quite artificially. And ironically, many of the individuals who had moved to these river basins and created their societies there had either moved because of the civil war that occurred in Colombia during decades, or because of natural disasters. So it was nothing new for them to move and move and move from natural disasters.
And I think it's quite a moving story. And I think also one thing where that's actually really like, it's literally I was just a part of a workshop about something called the climate collage, and I will have another video with another interview about this later, just kind of helping you to design kind of to understand climate change. And the one thing is kind of the founder was saying, which I thought was really touching and really also scary in some ways, is that at the end of the decade, the land, like, if we do what we're doing right now, there's going to be enough land for about 1 billion people. And there's like these maps also, like if you have 4 degrees temperature increase, and there's some new graphics which just show how much land is just not, like even Europe, Southern Europe, you can't really, it's going to be like really desert-like temperature and like dryness. And taking this into account, of course, what kind of movements we're going to have? Because right now you talk about like, thousands of people for some flooding or something. But the moment we have like billions of people who have to move, and this rather quickly, how are you going to deal with that? And of course, all the consequences you say when you move people who didn't really have been at one place, and suddenly they're completely supposed to move across the entire planet from like southern half to northern. I mean, yeah.
Exactly. Moving from even more extreme conditions, both naturally and socially, that's gonna consume a lot of resources that I don't think enough people have started seriously thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it's also just like, people, I think, starting to realize the consequence of adaptation versus mitigation, and the cost as well of it, and the human cost as well. A really sad story there. Maybe something as well, because I think you had some report also coming out recently and some work around there. Maybe some other insights you might want to share from that work.
We had a report coming out from the climate change and risk team on peace building in Somalia, and how the peace builders have been affected, and of course also the population has been affected in the implementation of the UN's mandate to support peace and reconciliation in Somalia by climate change. And what new with that report, I think, is that it's not a future-looking report. It's not a prognosis, as so many climate change reports are. It's actually a reflection of what evidence that's out there, and what has been what can be felt already and has been felt for years. So that's the latest product that we launched. But in general, what we do at this institute and in our team is that we follow the developments in the international security architecture and international peace arenas on how climate change is discussed in more traditional forums. So the past 10 years, there's been an increasing focus on climate change, although it's relatively controversial, and there's resistance, but there's also more and more movements, especially from small island states that can subscribe to the idea that this is actually an existential issue for us. This is about security.
Yeah, no, I think it's also one of the big issues, like topics again here at COP, of course. If you look at these countries who are even more direct affected, and unfortunately even didn't do something about it, right? Like they're not the source for all the greenhouse gases. Maybe one last question would be for you personally, like, because you spoke about this Colombia story, But do you kind of have a feeling when you kind of decide to do something about this topic of climate change? Because I'm sure there's probably more than one story. It's always like a nudging, I feel, in life. But why did you decide for this? Because I'm sure there are many other glamorous things we could do, or you could do, and then this kind of topic, which of course is very important, but also very tough sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. It's sometimes it doesn't feel like a choice. It's more like a need. But I think that I landed where I landed because I am interested in what's different. I always was. I spent a lot of time after my mandatory school in Sweden. I spent a few years on just backpacking, and by doing that, you meet so many people, and everyone is different to you, but a few things you do have in common, and one of that is that we share the same planet. We require the same life-sustaining conditions, and therefore climate change is something that is relevant for everyone, and it will always be. So this as some kind of core to so much is probably the reason why it consumes so much of me as an individual as well.
No, I mean, I can completely relate to this one. The moment you travel, you realize the commonalities, and then you realize, yeah, we have to figure this out together rather against each other. Perfect. Thanks so much, Karolina. This was really, thank you so much for sharing these stories and the work you do.
Yeah, thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.